Hello, welcome to this seminar which is about understanding and managing reactions to change with me, Felicity Dwyer. This seminar is for you if you're a line manager or team leader who's in a position of supporting your team as you go through an organisational change. This is our agenda for today. We'll start by thinking about the differences between change and transition. Are they the same thing or something a little bit different? We'll look at a couple of change curve models and consider the patterns of responses to change. We'll think about some of the reasons why people might resist change. And importantly, we'll think about some practical approaches that you can use at work to support your staff through change. The first question, is there a difference between change and transition? The American writer William Bridges suggests that there is. As you can see from this quote, Bridges thinks of change as the actual situation, the thing that changed, the thing that we're doing differently. We were working in the office and now we're working from home, for example. Transition is the psychological process that people go through in accepting, acknowledging and coming to terms with the change. So transition is an internal process. And because it's an internal psychological process, people will often go through transition at different stages, even if they're all effectively going through the change at the same time. And a model Bridges used to describe transition has 3 stages. The first stage in Bridges' transition model is endings. In order to move to something new, we have to accept that something has ended. Obviously, there can be negative emotions arising around endings. Sadness, letting something go, losing the familiar, worried about the future. But when we're supporting our teams, we do need to acknowledge endings. We need to recognise and celebrate what's gone before. We need to think about what we can take with us from the old into the new. And we need to recognise that people will be at different stages of accepting and coming to terms with the end of something. Then before we can go from the old into the new, Bridges describes a stage called the neutral zone. And this is a nowhere between two somewheres. So it's a kind of space in between. And again, it's a psychological space. It's when we've accepted there's an ending, but we haven't quite adjusted to what's coming next and how we're going to be in relation to what comes next. And this can be a time of confusion, of anxiety, of not being sure what's going to happen. It can also be a time of creativity. The future's not yet written. We might want to be different. We might want to take things in one direction or another. So there is a sense of possibility as well to the neutral zone. The third stage of transition is about beginnings. And Bridges distinguishes between the start, which again is the external start of something, and the beginnings where we feel we've really brought ourselves into the new beginning. And again, supporting teams through beginnings, you want to find ways of acknowledging the beginning, of making sure that everybody's really clear about why they've got to this place, why they've had to change, where they're going to, what their place is in the new reality. And again, as a team leader, as a supervisor, you're often the person who is most aware of what people are feeling on the ground and helping people to move towards this beginning. In the same time, you also may have a role in communicating things that have come down to you. So getting really clear about how you feel about the change, what sort of transition stage you are in, and what you need to do to be clear so that you can support your team is really, really important. Now, I think whenever you're in a role of supporting people through change, it is really important to start with yourself and your understanding of your own thoughts and feelings about it, so that you can then separate that from what other people might be going through. I've got a short exercise now, which I will invite you to pause the video and do. The exercise is just to think about a change that you've experienced in the past. And for this exercise, I'd probably look back at a change that's done and dusted. And as we go through, you might want to think about changes you'll currently go through. But just thinking about a change that you've been through in the past, do you recognise Bridges stages? Does this resonate with your experience? Something I probably should have said is that in real life you won't go through the stages quite as smoothly as the model suggests. Obviously you'll go back and forward, you'll have some certainty, then perhaps a little bit less. But do you recognise that idea of acknowledging an ending, of going through some sort of neutral zone or transition and then to a new beginning? And of course you might go through this quickly or less quickly depending on the size of the change. And just have a think of what kinds of thoughts and feelings did you experience during the transition, both negative and positive. So take a moment or two to do that, and then we'll move on with the seminar. I hope you've done the exercise, and I hope you've seen how that model might fit with your own experience. As I talk through the next couple of models, again I'll invite you just to think about, does this resonate with me? Have I been through this? And then we'll move on more to thinking about how you can support your team members as they go through the change cycle. The first change cycle model was the original one, really. This came from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she was thinking about all the emotions people go through when they experience a big change or a loss. So bereavement, serious illness, this kind of thing. And although it's not specifically a work-related model, I think it's a valuable one to know. I've certainly found this comforting when I've been through, big changes, big losses. And also, of course, as you go through your working career, everybody has to go through grief or loss at some point. So the first stage of it she calls denial, and this is when we can't quite take in the loss. Then we may have a mix of negative emotions. Sometimes we may feel angry. Bargaining is a stage where we're almost trying to take control of the situation, trying to convince ourselves that if we do this, there'll be a different outcome. Depression happens. You can see the curve goes up by then, because depression tends to happen when we've actually accepted that this is reality, the loss is real. And finally, we get to real acceptance. So even with a big change, even when people have gone through things that are tough, very tough, you can get to a point of acceptance and move on with your life. So obviously, this is a model that, you may or may not need to support staff through this, but I think it's a useful one to know. And as we move on to the next model, which is more work related, I think you'll see that there's a link with this model too. This next model was developed by Cynthia Scott and Dennis Jaff in the 1980s. So it's similar to the previous model, but it was developed much more in a workplace context. And they studied employee reactions to change in a number of American companies. And this 4-stage model is widely used in organisations, and I think it's a really good one to use as a manager if you're supporting team members through organisational change. So the first thing that can happen when you hear about a change is denial. It's people not taking on board that the change is going to happen. Yeah, maybe they've seen it before. Maybe they just don't want to engage with it. They're hoping that if they put their head in the sand, it will go away. So it starts with just a lack of engagement. Now, you might not see much happening at this point because before people really start to engage with the change, they're probably just not commenting or talking about it at all. So as soon as people start to engage with the change, even if it's quite negatively, then you have started that process of people being willing to understand and adapt to change. So it's not necessarily a bad thing when people start to complain about change, because it means they're starting to think about it. But a lot of people don't like change. We get comfortable with what we're doing, we feel skilled, we know our place in the organisation, we know we have a job, and when change comes in, it can start to feel quite threatening. So what will tend to happen is a stage of resistance. Now, there's a lot of reasons why people might resist change. They might feel quite scared, fearful. They might fear a loss of power. They might fear a loss of status. They might fear a loss of a sense of competence. People might feel angry. Often we find change harder to cope with when it feels like it's being imposed upon us. So we can feel angry that our working lives are being disrupted in this way. So there can be quite a lot of emotional issues around this. We might be frustrated that this change is being implemented when it's not actually necessary from our perspective. Lots of different things going on, particularly when people are just trying to get to grips with it. Perhaps they don't understand why this change is taking place. So there tends to be quite an emotional reaction, and then there can be quite a more negative but intellectual reaction. So people might be saying, well, this doesn't need to happen, this is completely unnecessary, what do they think they're doing? You know, quite a lot of negativity. You may get one or two people who are quite vocally negative. You may get some people who are less vocal but are going into themselves. You might notice a loss of productivity in your team, a loss of morale. So this can be a difficult stage to be managing or to be supervising, seeing people go through this. But it also means that people are taking the change on board. And there's things you can do as a manager and team leader to help that. And part of it is just being prepared to listen, to give people a space to talk things through, but also helping people to move on, helping people to see that, yes, these things are actually happening. And when people really start to engage with the change, you will find it gets to a point where people start to not just look at the past and think, why are things changing, but actually start to explore the future. So this is the explore stage. So this is when people might start thinking, well, what does this mean for me? You know, how am I going to adapt this? What's my place in the new setup? So again, helping people to think creatively, to think in a solution-focused way about their role is something really that you can do as a team leader and is helpful to people. Another thing that you can really do is provide communication of what you know about the change, about perspectives you have that people on the ground may not have, just to help people get a sense of what is the future and where do I fit in the future. So again, this can be quite a vocal stage. And finally, hopefully, people get to that commit stage, which is a bit similar to the beginning stage in the bridges, and people are actually just getting on with it. So at this point, there's liable to be less talking about the change because people are just getting on with their jobs. And hopefully at this point, you'll see people performing again. So if you've had a performance dip, that will go up. You'll see people, hopefully, if they've explored any additional learning they need for a new role, you'll see people gaining competence. So, you know, the new way of being will be settling down at this stage. As you can see in this model, the first stages tend to be a bit focusing on the past, so the endings. But then as people come to accept the change, so somewhere between resist and explore, then there tends to be a bit more of a focus on the future. Also, as you'll see, in the resist and explore phase, people will be thinking about themselves. What does this mean for me? What do I need to learn? What's my role in this new setup? But then as it moves on to commit, the focus is going to be more on just getting on with it and getting the job done, which of course is ultimately what you want for team performance. So I've now got an exercise for you based around this Scott-Jaff model. So thinking about a current change at work. So for this one, you might like to think of a change that you're going through at the moment, if you are going through one. And again, start with yourself and be honest. Where are you on the Scott-Jaff curve in relation to this change? If you're still feeling some resistance yourself, what do you need to move you to explore, for example, so that you can then support the rest of your team? Also, how would you recognise or find out where other team members might be? These models can be useful in providing a pattern or framework for helping people, but of course it's always important to know that people are individuals, people's reactions are different. So how can you find out what's really going on for your team members? And what can you do as a supervisor or team leader to support members of the team through the stages of change? What can you actually do? Practical things. And how can you encourage team members to support each other through the phases of change, which is also an important part of it. I'm going to ask you to pause for a moment, think about these questions, and then I'll reflect on some of the things you can do when you restart the video. So, where are you on the curve? And how can you recognise and discover where other team members might be? Well, obviously, you can observe, listen to what they're saying, ask them, have conversations, make sure you have a mix of one-to-one group conversations. But for all this to work, you need to have that good relationship and trust with your team members. So if you're in that position of communicating change, you need to make sure that you're clear, that you're honest with people, that you manage your own emotions so that you can be honest but not be negative. There is a skill in communicating the positives of the change, whilst also be open about the fact that it affects you. So it's really important to have those conversations. If you're seeing productivity dip, if you're seeing increased sickness absence, these might be some of the signs that people are in a resistance phase to change. When you start to see people talking about the future as if it's a reality, then people might be in the explore phase. And obviously, if you can see people just getting on, adapting, working in the new way, you get a sense that those people are in the commit phase. So how do you support people through these stages? Initially, when a change is communicated, you need to give time for it to sink in. Time for questions. Help people to get through that denial phase quickly. So you may need to repeat the communication. You may need to communicate in different ways, one-to-one, group meetings, written communication. And you may need to allow a little bit of time for it to sink in. Then, when you come to the resistance stage, that's the stage where you need to allow time for people to talk, one-to-one, in team meetings. You need to find a way of facilitating those discussions so people feel heard, but it doesn't just go into a spiral of negativity. So one of the things that can really help, for example, in a team meeting, is to make sure that you go around and everyone gets a chance to say how they feel or what they think, and then the next person says what they feel. So you're giving everybody space. It's also really important to have one-to-one conversations. Some people won't share in a big group, but they might share in a one-to-one discussion. Also be aware that some people can be very negative and bring other people down. That's quite a challenge. So you need to balance those voices with people who are more positive, and you need to find a way of really structuring the situation so that everybody's voice is heard. That's so important. And that might mean having a one-to-one conversation with some of the most vocal people, listening to them, hearing why they're so upset about the situation, but also encouraging them to think about the impact that their behaviour has on others, and think about how together you can work to help them through this change. When you get to explore, then that can be quite a creative stage. So find ways to capitalise on that. Have team meetings where you're thinking about, what do we want to be? How do we want this to look? Again, keep communicating. Communicate what's going to be expected in this new stage. Communicate and ask people to get involved in doing what they can to adjust. Making sure that you've got the right training in place, the right development, so that if people are taking on new skills or using a new system, they feel confident they're able to do it. So it's really about getting engagement at this stage. Where you've got people who are really positive about the change, almost the people who go through the curve more quickly, they can be unofficial change champions. They can share what they're learning, but also keep an eye on perhaps the quieter people who are a little bit further behind, or if you don't know quite where they are. So making sure that you look to every team member as an individual and helping them through the change. And finally, when you get to the commit stage, it's like the beginnings. Acknowledge, we've been through this change, we're here, we're successful. So get that sense of actually we've been through this as a team together. That can help raise a good quality morale for the next stage in the organisation's development. I'm going to say a little word about culture here. Team culture, organisational culture, is sometimes described as the way we do things around here. Now, as individuals, we fit into the culture of an organisation, we know what's expected of us, and sometimes after a change, the culture's changed, the way we do things around here has changed. So again, I think by taking a positive approach, by celebrating and recognising the new reality, you can help embed that culture a bit, because otherwise it's quite easy to slip back, and you want to maintain that positivity when people have been through a change. And that means acknowledging what people have done. Something, of course, that's really important when you're helping people through change is to understand people's personalities and what makes them different, because we all react in a different way to change. I've mentioned, for example, introversion and extroversion. So extrovert people tend to be quite outgoing. They tend to be quite stimulated by the presence of other people. And people who are strongly extrovert often work things out by talking through them. So you'll have a team meeting, you'll know the people who are most vocal, and often they like to take the space and talk things through. People who are more introvert sometimes like to have a little bit more thinking time before they talk about things. And sometimes, if you're not mindful, the voices of introverts can be overlooked, even though introverts often bring so much thought and consideration and perspective to a meeting. So it's making sure that it's comfortable for everybody to share. Make sure that you have one-to-one conversations with people. Make sure that if you're discussing a question in a group, you give people time to think about the question in advance. So if you're looking at a new way of structuring the team meetings, for example, don't just bring it up as an agenda item out of the blue. Let people know that that's what you're going to talk about. Ask them to think about their ideas, so that way you'll be more likely to tap into the thinking of your introverts as well as your extroverts. Make sure everybody has a chance to speak. Let everybody's voice be heard before you open up to a general discussion. If you find one or two people are dominating, break into small groups. Have a discussion with one other person. Just find ways of engaging people. Another personality distinction can be between people who are comfortable with change, people who like that sense of possibilities and lots of options, versus people who really like to be clear about what they're going to be doing and when, who like really structure and next steps. So again, some people might be happy with the more open-ended change scenarios, whereas others, even if you haven't got the big full picture yet, will at least be more comfortable if they know actually what's expected of them this week, next month. So it's trying to balance that big picture of what you know about the change with actually giving people some certainty about what's expected from them. Sometimes people can lose a bit of confidence or get demotivated during a change, and having some understanding of the research into motivational needs can be helpful to you as a team leader or a supervisor. Now, here are some of the motivational needs that have been identified in research. This isn't an academic presentation, but everything I'm talking about here is research evidence-based. A very strong need in most people is to have a sense of achievement, a sense of competence. Nobody goes to work to have a bad day at work and get nothing done, or very few of us. So sometimes during a change, people can feel that they don't know what's expected of them. They don't know what good looks like, and that can hit motivation and confidence. So it's really important, even in a change, to make sure people are clear about what's expected of them now, and that you recognise and give positive feedback to the contributions that people are making. So to maintain that sense of achievement in contributing to whatever needs to be done. Another thing that's really important to most people are good, positive relationships at work. Again, one of the things that can make the biggest difference to somebody's motivation at work is their relationship with their manager. So if you're a line manager or a team leader, what are you bringing to the relationship? How are you supporting your team members through change? It can make a really, really big impact. And how can you make sure that there are friendly relations within the team? Now, in any team situation, but also particularly if people are feeling under pressure and changed, you can get conflicts arising. This is not in itself a bad thing, because conflicts are better coming out in the open than just simmering under the surface. But you do need to find a way to discuss and resolve them effectively. Avoid taking sides. Get the sense of there's one person's perspective, there's another person's perspective. Can we understand each other? Can we meet in a middle? Can we look for compromises or even win-win solutions so that both people get a bit of what they want? So, for example, if you've got rota changes, somebody's happy with a rota, somebody isn't. Is there a way you can kind of find an approach in the middle so most people feel okay with it? So it's really important to have those conversations. And something that really, really helps as well is the willingness to challenge assumptions. So sometimes we assume somebody will be happy with this or won't be happy with this, but we haven't really taken the time to ask and understand their perspective. Another thing about relationships is just to be kind and supportive and pleasant. A little bit of kindness goes a long way. Another motivational need is the need for autonomy, and that's the need to be responsible for our own destiny, to make our own decisions. Most people do not like to be micromanaged. Think about yourself. Do you like to be micromanaged? But sometimes in a change situation, we don't feel in control. We haven't asked for the change. We're perhaps being given more directions, more instructions than we were in the past. So something about engaging people, about giving people as much autonomy as possible within the constraints that you're working in. So even if that's just saying, this change is happening, you need to work in this way, but what can you do to make the most of it? So it's about that, encouraging people to take responsibility within the constraints that we're working. And finally, a strong motivational need for some of us, and certainly this may be the case within the educational sector, is that sense of purpose, a sense of doing something that's worthwhile. And this really does link in with communication of change. We need to understand the reason for the change. We need to see where we're going as an organisation. We need to understand where we fit into it, what our contribution is to the whole. So I think really making sure that you can link what an individual is doing with the direction of the organisation is really important. And if you're in a team leader or a line management role, then that's perhaps something that you can do importantly, is be that bridge between frontline staff and the more senior management and some of the decisions that are coming down. So a little bit of an exercise now, if you'd like to pause the video and just think about your team, the context of your team and the change you're going through, or even if you're not going through a change at the moment, this exercise is worth doing, and thinking, how can I make sure that individuals get a sense of achievement? Have my team members got as much autonomy as I can possibly give them? What do I know about what matters to them, their values? What will give them a sense of purpose? And what are the relationships like within the team? Is there anything I can do to improve my relationships with team members, but also to encourage a better and stronger team dynamic? So I invite you just to take a moment to think about these in connection with your team members. And you might also think, what do I actually know about what motivates my team members? So if you find it hard to put your finger on people's individual motivations, that could be a conversation worth having as well. So take a moment to do that, and then we'll resume. What did you come up with? For achievement, perhaps you can work with people so they've got goals that are stretching but still achievable, so they get the sense of, yes, I've done it. Do you provide specific positive feedback when people have met goals? When it comes to autonomy, how much autonomy do people like? Are you telling people things that you don't need to be telling them? Sometimes we give too much autonomy and people want a bit more support. So how do you know you've got the balance right? Are you actually having those conversations? With a sense of purpose, are we reminding ourselves often enough of why we're here, why we're doing what we do? If you're in a support role, a business support role, sometimes you can lose that sense of a big picture and what we're really trying to do as an organisation and how we're really making a difference to people's lives. So just taking time to remember that sometimes and to feel part of it can be really helpful. And in relationships, have you made an effort? And with relationships, what's your relationship like with the individuals in your team? What can you do to improve the way you relate to them? Could you listen a little bit more? Could you be a little bit more open? Could you be a little bit more positive? Just think about your role in the relationship, because that's the only thing that you really have control over, how you behave in a relationship. And also, what are you doing to ensure a good team dynamic? If there are issues, personality clashes, is there anything you could do to help facilitate a conversation between those people and move it onto a more positive footing? Now I want to talk a little about how you might help team members with time and overload management. Now, overload is really when people have got too much work. There's also a related word, overwhelm, which is when people may not have too much work, but they may feel as if they have, so they feel overwhelmed by the work. Sometimes in a change situation, people may feel overwhelmed even though objectively they have got enough time in their day to do their tasks. So I think there's two elements there. Now, one of the reasons why we sometimes feel overwhelmed when we're in a change situation is that things actually take longer because they are no longer habitual. Now, when we go into work, a lot of the tasks we do day to day, we've done them a million times before. We don't have to think about how to do them. We don't need to, draw on any real reserves of mental energy to think through the process. We just get on and do the task. Yes, we may need to concentrate well. Yes, we may need to, adjust to that particular situation that comes up for us that day. But we're not really out of our comfort zones. We know what we're doing. We know our jobs. When we're in situations of change, then we're out of that habit. So, for example, if you're suddenly using a new computer system or some new software, you have got to now think about how the software works as well as just doing what you need to do with it. And that takes more mental energy. So it is really something to recognise in yourself and others that when we're on a learning curve or when we're adjusting to change, things can take longer. And that's before you've taken into account, obviously, the emotion reactions to change and the things we talked about earlier. So partly it's around recognising that, things can take longer. But it's also just about thinking, are we managing our time effectively? So, for example, if things are changing, are priorities changing? Are the things that used to be important in our role now less important? Do we need to prioritise other areas? And something you can do as a team leader is really help the team to understand what's the most important, what needs to get done, what are the priorities. You can also help facilitate learning within the team. So if somebody is confident on a certain system, what do they know, what tips do they have that can help others? So as we come to the end of this seminar, I just want to briefly recap what we've covered and ask you to complete one more exercise. So we've looked at stages of change, of Bridges' ideas that individuals go through stages of transition which may not be entirely aligned with the external change. He talks about the importance of acknowledging endings and perhaps that neutral zone, that in-between state, before we can really go into beginnings. We looked at change curve models, and in particular the Scott-Jaff curve, where people move from denial to a resistance of change before they move to a more creative exploration and a committing to the new. We've looked at the fact that although there's patterns to how people experience change, people also have very different reactions depending on their personality. Some people are much more comfortable with change than others. Are the people that you can recruit to be your change champions and to help you in your communication of things that need to happen. We looked at motivational needs and how to make sure that people still feel committed to the purpose of the organisation, that you're acknowledging people's achievements, that you're encouraging good relationships, and that you're giving people as much autonomy as possible, particularly if the change feels imposed and people feel they're losing a sense of control. And we thought a little bit about time management, in particular about priorities, that if things have shifted and changed, then you may need to work with people to be clear about what's a current priority. And in addition, that things may literally take longer because people are on that learning curve and things that were a habit perhaps are no longer a habit and therefore require more mental energy. So I have a short exercise for you. Firstly, have a think back. What are you taking away from this session? What was a key piece of learning for you? And then think about what you actually do. So it's the one or more specific actions that you will take to support your team members through change. Ideally, something that you can do straight away. Something to support, encourage and help people move through to a successful change. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you well in supporting your team members.